Well, good morning from Ithaca, New York, home of Cornell University. My name is Nicholas Phillips, and we're so glad to have you with us this morning. It's pretty common knowledge that many major brands rely heavily on factories in Asia to support their footwear and clothing apparel. Between Bangladesh, Cambodia, Pakistan, and Vietnam, together they house around 10,000 of these factories. Now, as you'll learn today, because of global warming, extreme heat and flooding are threats to these key apparel production hubs. Join me in welcoming Jason Judd, the Executive Director of the ILR School's Global Label Institute, and Patricia Sutanto, the Vice CEO of PT Pan Brothers, as they discuss a new report that looks at the connection between the changing climate and its impact on apparel production. Jason, Ann, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thank you. And I kind of want to start off with a little background. Now, in your report, you mentioned that many fashion companies focus on increasing recycled materials and less water usage when it comes to sustainability. Now, I'm wondering, Jason, what sparked your interest in looking at it from the other perspective, so more from the climate change effective things and things like that? I know you have a couple slides that you want to reference as well.
Yeah, right. The fashion industry is focused, like all the rest of us, on what we call mitigation, which is reducing greenhouse gas emissions, because that'll help hold the global temperature down. But missing in their strategies in this approach is what we call adaptation, which is just the other end of things. How do we help workers and manufacturers who are already dealing with extreme heat and intense flooding in lots of the places where apparel production and footwear are made? How do we get them to focus on those issues? Because things are bad and getting worse in some of these places already. And we turned to this question because we were at work on a paper about the COVID crisis a couple of years ago, and we thought, well, this is bad, but it might get worse. There will be another crisis. It'll look like this, or it'll be a little different. It'll come fast, or it'll come slow. Are we ready for the next one? And in our estimation, the next one was the climate crisis. And what would climate breakdown look like in places where t-shirts, underwear, shoes, all of this gets made? Still, 80% of what we buy here in the U.S. and in Europe is produced in parts of Asia, from China to Southeast Asia to South Asia. And most of these places, most of these production centers are places where high heat is an issue or flooding is an issue. So that's a long answer. That's why we took up this paper, and we break it down, this analysis, into high heat and flooding, because those are the most immediate. Those are the urgent effects that workers and manufacturers are feeling. And I can run through a couple of slides to show you what we.
Yes, yes, please do, Jason.
Okay, so we paired up with. We're not climate scientists. We're not social geographers, and we teamed up with an outfit that has some of those analytical skills. It's an investment fund based in the UK called Schroders. They're a massive fund that manages funds for others, and they're, like we are, deeply concerned about the impacts of climate breakdown. On their part, they're interested in how this will affect investors and earnings. And at our end of things, we're interested in how this affects workers and employers. So we paired up for this analysis, and we looked first at heat. And this first slide we have shows a wheel with what we call exceedance days. So in the world of high heat, you pick a threshold and you say above this level, the heat, or the combination of heat and humidity, what we call the wet bulb globe temperature, that heat-humidity combination will be too high, and it'll start eating into workers' productivity. The body just starts to slow down. And in the business, that threshold, that wet bulb globe temperature level, is about 31 Celsius. It's not like 31 Celsius, which is about, 88, 90 degrees, plenty Fahrenheit. That's plenty hot. But the combination of heat and humidity above this threshold of 31 Celsius really starts to eat into workers' output and ultimately into their health. When you get to higher numbers like 35 degrees or 38 degrees, workers can feel exhaustion, dehydration, fainting, heat stroke. And at the upper reaches, you die. High heat and the combination of high heat and humidity can be fatal. And in some apparel factories, the numbers are approaching those upper bounds. And we were concerned that the industry did not have its eye on this problem. So we ran the analysis, and in that wheel, you can see sort of the distribution of all the days in the year across the different production centers that we looked at. And places like Karachi in Pakistan and Managua in Nicaragua, Colombo, Sri Lanka are going to get the worst of it. They're going to have 150, 160, 170 days where in the year when the temperature outside is going to be above that threshold. So that's serious business. And we ran the projections not just for today, but also for 2030 and 2050, because we know that temperatures are rising, and we wanted to see how bad will it get in some of these places. Mm-hmm. So that's what that graph represents. And then we were able to get some data on heat. We wanted to go a little deeper on this heat question. And then in the next slide, you'll see these line graphs. This is a representation of data from the ILO. The ILO is like the WHO. It's a UN agency focused on work, on labor. And in that graph, you can see the percentage of factories, these are apparel and footwear factories, the percentage of factories in Cambodia where lots of apparel and footwear get made in that 7-year period where the temperature inside the factory was higher than 32 degrees Celsius, which is hot. For Americans, 32 degrees Celsius is, sort of low 90s. That's hard to operate in, even if you're acclimatized, if you're accustomed to high heat and humidity. When you get to 32, 33, 35 degrees, your health may not suffer, but your output does, and that affects workers' earnings, and that affects the employer's earnings. So it's an issue. Mm-hmm. And you can see also in that series of line graphs that the percentage of factories where the temperature is higher inside than outside is almost half. And so those findings all by themselves were significant for us. Mm-hmm. But even more telling is that most of the countries that we studied in this paper, Vietnam, Cambodia, Pakistan, Bangladesh, only Cambodia had data like this available to us. So we don't even know what the numbers are in those other places. And cities like Karachi in Pakistan and Dhaka in Bangladesh, where lots of apparel get made, are hotter still than Cambodia. So that's heat. That's just sort of the size and the intensity of the problem. Then we turned to flooding. In the next slide, you can see the maps that we developed together with our research partner Schroders. We took flood maps or projections of future flooding, rainfall flooding, river flooding, and sea level rise, which we also call storm surge. And we ran projections for 2030 and 2050 in these 4 centers, the main production centers in these 4 countries: Cambodia, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Vietnam. And you can see in these graphs, Dhaka, which is the main production center for apparel in Bangladesh. If you're probably wearing something right now. Wherever you are in the U.S., you're probably wearing something that was made in one of the factories on that map of Dhaka. So much of our apparel, underwear, T-shirts, pants, shirts gets made there. So in the 2 graphs, you can see on the left, you can see in gold, that's storm surge or sea level rise in 2030 in a routine year. So no extreme flooding events. And then you can see below it in red what riverine or rainfall flooding looks like. And those little blue dots all over the place, those are apparel factories. So you can see where the water is going to encroach on the factories. And it doesn't look too grim in 2030. You can see a handful of factories at the southern end of that map getting inundated. That's about a quarter of a meter, a half a meter. So not intolerable. Not unmanageable. But look at the maps on the right. That's Dhaka again, but that's 2050. And again, gold is sea level rise or storm surge. And you can see that the flood levels are going to be higher because the color is darker, and it's going to impinge, it's going to encroach on a much larger number of factories. And then below it in red is riverine and rainfall flooding. And you can see there that it's going to, the risk is enormous. It in fact touches every neighborhood, every industrial neighborhood where this stuff is getting made. So we ran the numbers on this stuff to see what percentage of these factories would be inundated or would be at risk of flooding of a half meter or more. So a couple of feet. And in Bangladesh, in 2050, that number is 27%. So at least 1 in 4 factories of today's factories would be inundated at a half meter or more in a major flood event. Wow. That's unnerving if you're a worker and you're trying to get to work, or you're an employer and you're trying to keep your factory open, or you're involved in the industry around the industry. You have to get goods along roads to ports. You have to make sure that the port is not inundated. The stuff has to be able to keep moving. So flooding is a major risk. We also ran those numbers for southern Vietnam because that's a major production center. Much of Nike and Adidas footwear production, for example, happens in the south of Vietnam. Half of Nike's production, I think, comes from half their footwear production comes from Vietnam. And in southern Vietnam, along the Mekong River Delta, the percentage of factories that would be inundated at a half meter or more in 2050, 22%.
Wow.
So those are frightening numbers, but the paper's not intended to frighten. It's intended to sort of describe the scale and the intensity of the problem. And then we move on to, okay, this doesn't look good. What do we do about it?
And just real quickly, Jason, has a study or report like this ever been published before on this specific topic?
No. We were having to sort of build this thing as we were flying. And we drew on the expertise of lots of people who know different parts of the elephant, or can have a view on different parts of the picture. But I think we were the first ones to push it all together. And then the real kicker was this economic analysis, which I can describe briefly. We wanted to put dollar figures to this because it's one thing to say the flood levels will be X and the heat levels will be Y, but it's something else to say here's the possible economic damage, because that's when you get all the players to tune in, the investors, the brands that buy the product in these places, the employers, the manufacturers, the unions, the regulators. Everybody tunes in when you can put a dollar figure to the problem. So that's what we did next.
Yeah, it does seem like when you can, like you said, put a dollar amount to it, then that's when people's ears perk up and they're like, okay, we really, really, really need to do something. And Jason, thank you for that. And Anne, I know you've been kind of waiting patiently. I want to kind of loop you into this conversation. So Anne, as a leading manufacturer of apparel in Asia, what's one thing that stands out for you regarding this report?
Okay, so thank you very much, Nick, as well as Jason. Actually, to be fair with you, the climate change indeed happening, right? This is not only about this report. Actually, a few years back, to be exact, in Pan Brothers, we are actually based in Indonesia, which is, of course, not yet a part of what Jason has mentioned regarding the city as well as the country. But again, the heat is uncontrollable, especially this year. I'm sure everyone here as well as within the audience know that we actually feel hotter 2 degrees Celsius more. But 10 years ago, actually in Pan Brothers, in our whole factories, because we have presence in province of Banten, province of West Java, as well as province of Central Java. Every time we walk in the factory, we have the old factories, we have the newer factories. We actually slightly change the way we work. So we make sure that the temperatures as well as the humidity of each factory really fit the conditions of where we can produce the right outfit as well as the right output. Actually, it correlates. So what Jason has mentioned earlier, It's very psychological, right? If you have the right comfort of temperature, of course, each region has different comfort level, but then you would make sure your workers as well as yourself actually are comfortable the way you work in the temperature. We cannot be too cold, we cannot be too hot, and every region, of course, has different temperature. For example, in Indonesia, more than 30 degree is not acceptable, but less than 20 degree also not acceptable because it's too cold, right? The workers are not used to cold weather as well because we only have 2 seasons instead of 4 seasons. So we only have rain and less rain, right? So on that regard, with regards to heat, we make sure that the temperature is as the normal temperatures within the region. So that's how we work. So of course we have, we don't use air conditions, but we actually use a blower where the blow is part of the water curtain, for example, to have the heat. And for the newer factories, actually we make sure that our rooftop actually is also part of the cool or the cooler system of the whole spectrum, as well as the way we situations our sunlight is actually in a way where it's not directly impacted the whole building structure. So it's more toward the green side rather than not. On the back of, you see my virtual, this is not virtual by now, but this is an actual office, green office of Penn Brothers in Central Java. So this is actually not air conditions, but the degree here is from time to time is always about 25 to 26 degree. It's not cold, but it's not hot. It's very breezy. But the way we structured this new building, this is a 2014 building, is on the green concept. So the way it's being sunlighted and also the structure of the building itself. So that's on the newer generations of our building. But on the old part, we do, of course, additional part. But to be part of the flood, right? I think flood is also part of the climate change, right? Because of the heat, the water is being flooded more. And sometimes it's not only about rainfall, but also about the sea level versus versus the land. So this is something that is not only a micro part of the supply chain of the fashion and textile industry. So it's not only the problem of the employer or the employee or the brands, but actually this is the whole nation's problem, right? Because this is not only one sector problem. This is the whole sector's problem and the whole nation's problem. And therefore we have COP, we have COP. We have COP28 this year in Dubai, and last year we have COP27. So actions need to be done. It's not only on our side, because this is a very micro scale, right? What Jason and we have done in the whole ecosystem is very micro. But what can the world see? I mean, a lot of data is pointing out of this global climate warming, right? But what could we do as the whole nations as one is what we actually reach out, and why Jason and I have this talk, right? Because people are suffering. What Jason has mentioned on the people, on the city, on the country, the economic damage is real thing. But too many talks, too many data. So what do we do? What as a nations, what do we do in a scale? As a human being, do we want to suffer on this planet, or we want to do a real actions? Real actions on the floor. That's why we are on this discussion, right?
Yeah.
And
I
go for it, Jason.
Go ahead. Well, Nick, I had a couple of thoughts, couple reactions. One is that what Anne is describing, the changes in the design elements for factories is crucial. And so some aspects of this problem, in particular the high heat, vulnerability to flooding, is being taken care of sort of factory by factory as as factories that have access to finance, have money, have long-term relationships with buyers, they can afford to move. I don't mean leave the country. I mean move from the old city center where these factories were first built. Maybe they were set up inside an old warehouse, which is concrete and poorly ventilated. And now, after 20 years in the business, they're able to move 20 kilometers out, and they're able to move to literally higher ground, and they're able to build a building that incorporates all these new design elements of the quote green building, passive cooling systems, roofs that reflect the heat, ventilation that's far superior to the old-fashioned traditional factory. So some share of this problem is being dealt with, year on year as factory by factory. But what Anne says about flooding in particular is bigger than the industry. So this affects everyone. It affects workers who tend to live in low-lying areas, and it affects other industries. It obviously has an impact on agriculture, but other light manufacturing, car parts, all sorts of things are made in this tropical band on the planet where heat is rising and flooding is becoming more intense. And while you can address heat in one building, or you can cool the building and you can cool the people, flooding is something that is larger than the fashion business, and it's going to require big investments by governments to protect these places. And it's not just a matter of building structures that keep the water out. It's introducing new elements in the planning process that require that new factories are constructed in a way that makes them less vulnerable to flood and reduces the temperature inside. And we ran as part of we talked to lots of manufacturers, workers, brands as we were writing this report. Some of the work already done, some of the research already completed shows that there are relatively modest investments that manufacturers can make. Manufacturers, governments, brands acting together can make to bring down the temperature, improve the ventilation inside buildings, and that the costs or the return on those investments is prompt. It's a matter of a handful of years, and the costs are not enormous. So I'd say that's the good news. And we showed against that what the possible economic damage is if the fashion industry in each of these countries, or the producers, do nothing. If they pursue business as usual, the heat will climb, and the floods and the waters will rise, and the damage in terms of losses will be enormous. We ran the numbers between 2025 and 2030 for these 4 countries that we studied, and the fall off in terms of export earnings in that 5-year period would be on the order of 22%. So 22% fall off together. Wow. In export earnings across those 4 countries, if they do nothing, that is, if they don't invest in climate adaptation, cooling buildings, cooling people, preventing flood damage. And then we ran those numbers once more for 2050, and as you can imagine, that 22% just widens out. It's like a giant jaw. It goes from 22% in 2030 to about 68% in 2050. And it's not just a loss in potential earnings. It's also a loss. It's new jobs that aren't created. So by 2030, the number of new jobs that would not be created, we say lost, the number of jobs lost across these 4 countries, 1 million jobs. And that's a big deal anywhere, but it's a particularly big deal in a place like Bangladesh, where the unemployment or the underemployment rate is high. In 2050, that job loss figure is 8.6 million. Enormous. So you take those potential losses and you set them against the modest investments required to create a climate adaptive industry, and it's kind of a no-brainer. And some manufacturers like Pan Brothers, they have long-term relationships with these major buyers in the U.S. and Europe, and they have access to capital and the know-how, and they're already doing this. but there are lots of smaller players in the business who do work for other less brands with lower margins, or who pay less attention to these issues. And those smaller factories may struggle to come up with the funding, the $10 million that it might cost to shut down an existing factory in a center city and move it to a suburb. Not everybody's got that kind of money at hand. And that's part of the solution. So finance is part of the problem.
Sure. And I have a quick follow-up for you, Ann. But first, Jason, I want to ask you, one thing that really stood out to me in the report was that you mentioned, kind of shifting the factories and not leaving the country entirely, but just moving the country a little bit where it's a little bit more safe from flooding and heat and things like that. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more to that, and just, noting that, again, it's not about, essentially leaving an entire country, just, maybe moving a factory or setting up a new factory in somewhere that may be able to fight against the flooding or against the heat or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, this is a big issue. It came up again and again as we were talking to experts about what we had found. It's called cut and run. And in the apparel business, which is, all over the world, cut and run is a thing. It means you're done with one factory, or you're done with one sourcing country, and you're moving on because the price isn't right, or regulations have changed for one reason or another. It no longer works for that buyer. That buyer could be Walmart or Nike, H&M. They just decide they're done with a particular place, and it's time to move on. It's been happening for decades. I mean, this work was originally done here in the U.S. It's done in the Northeast, and then it migrated to the South, to North Carolina, and then down to the Texas border, and then into Mexico, and then it moved to China and Korea, and now this work is done in 50 different places. So it's always on the move. Our concern was that some buyers, some investors would read the report and say, this is just one thing too many. This is yet another risk that I hadn't counted on. And I can no longer do business in these places, these climate vulnerable places. Let's move. And we addressed that risk in the paper. There are a couple of answers. One is when these big brands, let's use as an example Target. When Target develops its sourcing strategy, here are all the places we're going to buy apparel. It's a complex calculus. There are lots of factors. Price is always price is number one, number two, and number three. And then might be the infrastructure and the ability to get the product to the port on time, and then the number of days between the port and the port in Cambodia and the port on the west coast of the United States. All those factors determine what the sourcing strategy is and where they're going to buy their product. So just climate vulnerability is by itself not going to require Target to reorganize its global sourcing strategy. But it's something they're going to have to work into their analysis because it may affect their sourcing strategy, and because we know it's affecting workers and manufacturers right now. They're going to have to deal with this, in one part of the business or another. So that's one reason. Sourcing decisions are complex. And another is it's just not obvious where apparel and footwear manufacturers would go. They're already in places where the infrastructure has been built for them, where the prices are relatively low. I mean, they've scoured the globe for relatively low-cost manufacturing centers, and there aren't places they could easily shift to where the capacity exists to produce all they need. Production in Asia has expanded constantly over the last 30 years, and now represents 75% of all U.S. apparel imports. You can't replicate that in Egypt and Turkey and Honduras in a 10-year period. It's too much too fast. So for all those reasons, we think cut and run is not a good idea. The last one is it's no good for workers and manufacturers. They've developed skills, they've built factories, and the brands have obligations, not necessarily legal ones, but they have obligations to these people and these places. And walking away from them is bad.
And as a quick follow-up, Ann, I know Jason touched on this a little bit regarding, the extreme heat that can be in some of these factories and everything like that. I'm wondering if there's anything that you've heard of or, any folks that you're working with in maybe the government sector of setting up rules regarding limits on just how hot some of these factories can get.
Actually, on heat part, I didn't recall any regulations on the heat part. Of course, on noise and so on, yes, there is a regulations, but not on the heat part. But heat is something that is not only part of the workers, right? So also part of the management of the factories. And the management of the factories actually working alongside with the workers. So in Indonesia, I mean, again, this is something that is slightly different perhaps than other countries that Jason has mentioned. In Indonesia, we are a very democratic country. The freedom of voice are being empowered. And then, in Indonesia also, the workers has a union that they can actually discuss and talk with. And if the heat become very unbearable, they will, of course, we as the management would see a lot of absentee, a lot of people get sick, like Jason has mentioned, and this would alarm us in any regards. We are not only talking about heat, for example, pollution as well on the AQI, the air quality index. It also affects the respirations, right? So this is something that we always concern because absentee because of sick is always a paid leave, right? So this would, of course, affects the economy of the factory itself. So this is something that we never ridicule, and it doesn't have to be regulated because it's very logical for us to ensure that the workers are in a comfort, but they also need to be productively safe. And we need to make sure that the output is what it is, right? So it's a very common sense. And this is not a dictatorship country, right? The workers can go to any other sectors freely, and we lose our best talents because our working environment is not good enough for the workers to produce things. So Indonesia is, since 1998, we have a reformations of democracy. So this is something that is slightly different perhaps than the countries that Jason has mentioned. So it's not only about the regulations on heat, but the common sense, the cultures, and the fundamental values of Indonesia is a bit different. I'm not saying that the other countries cannot do the same. Through time, they would be able to. But from the employer as well as the brand side, they need to know that human is human, no matter where we are. Just imagine, this is an old school, 25 years ago, I've been in this business for 27 years, right? 25 years ago, someone on the compliance side said to me, Anna, imagine, can you allow your daughter or your son working in this factory? And you have to imagine that all your workers is actually your children, right? So it's a humanity kind of thing. So as an employer, as a brand, please don't squeeze things that are not needed. No matter, like what Jason has mentioned, no matter where you go, you need to have a sustainability on your global supply chain, right? And humanity is part of it because human is actually the end users, right? Same thing with the end users. Please don't look beyond, please look beyond what you buy, where you actually source. Be also a responsible customers or end users, that you only source from reliable, resourceful, and sustainable part, because we all can act in a small way and ensure that the global supply chain are clean cleaner than not. Because this is, at the end, is human act. When you buy shoes, when you buy clothes, please make sure that the brands also carry the global supply chain, the clean global supply chain. To that regards, each one of us can do small actions where, if the whole nations actually have the same fundamental value, then, we can change all the climate change that is impedable, right?
And
not much, but at least some, to have more sustainability on our earth, right?
And I'm wondering, and what do those conversations look like when you're talking to buyers about thinking about this concept of not just the people buying these products, but the people who are actually working on these products and understanding that, hey, we need to make this environment safe for them. What do those conversations with buyers look like?
So actually, Jason is right. I'm not saying we are lucky, but we actually also select like-minded brands. Actually, in the last, since 2010, the whole management of Pan Brothers decided that what we want to grow with healthy, sustainable brands. Because, by slaving away our supply chain procurement to a brand that does not respect our way of thinking, our workers as well as our being, it's not going to sustain. I mean, it might be, we have a joy with them 1 year, 2 years, but we are not talking 1 year, 2 years when it comes to our workers and ourselves, right? We talk about our lifetime, right? So when we talk about our lifetime, who do we want to partner with? Do we want to partner with a brands that understand the concept of human being, or we want to partner with brands who only focus on revenue, profit margins, and squeezing things, right? And changing every time. Because we need a plan. This is still as much as labor intensive, even though we are industry 4.0 champion in our country, but doesn't mean that we can scrap all the human. It's still very much labor intensive. Behind Pan Brothers, we have about 30,000 workers, right? 30,000 employees, 30,000 of my children, right? So we have to make sure that this is sustainable. And we in the top managements are responsible to select our strategic partner of brands, our strategic partner of our suppliers. Even now, as of we speak, we actually have started the journey of our net zero on scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. I think the buyers does not require us to do it, but we require ourselves to do it just because we want to be responsible in our micro way. And we hope that we inspire the whole global supply chain. It's not easy, like Jason said, but you can do this. We have to start small. We have to really encourage everyone within the industry to actually change the mindset on how we buy things and how we procure things and how we produce things.
And as a quick follow, or go ahead, Jason.
Well, I had a couple thoughts. What Ann says is right. And there are major manufacturers and major buyers who figured out, they're partners, and they figured out how to make investments and design processes that maintain their margins, but are also good for workers. But there's another end to the industry. There's a whole other set of buyers whose margins are smaller and who are more careless. I don't need to name names, but in the U.S. we've got lots of retailers who don't pay attention to this stuff, and they're constantly putting downward pressure on price. They're always telling their manufacturers, okay, I want you to do this. I want it to look like this. I want it delivered by this date. And I want you to add solar panels to your roof, and I want you to ensure that the ventilation is whatever. And I'm going to pay you less for this order than I paid you for the last one.
Wow.
So it puts when Ann talks about the squeeze, that's what she's talking about, this constant downward pressure on price. So it's not enough for the brands to say, we're a sustainable brand, or we care about our workers, if they're putting this sort of constant downward pressure on price and making it harder for their manufacturers to do all the things the brands say they care about. So that's important. And for that end of the industry, regulation is important because somebody's got to raise the floor. Somebody has to say, here's the standard. It's non-negotiable. We're going to enforce it across the business. There are brands at the top who can figure this out for themselves, and they do it because they understand that it's profitable, that it's good for workers, et cetera. But there's a whole subset. It may be 80% of the industry that needs that pressure to meet a particular standard. Otherwise, workers are going to workers and manufacturers, but workers in particular will suffer. And what Anne said is also one other thing that Anne said made me think about how the industry is changing and what makes it change practices. In Vietnam, apparel works 20 years ago was a hot ticket. Getting a spot in an apparel factory, working for Adidas, for example, was a boon. But nowadays, workers would rather work in a different environment. They'd rather be working in an electronics factory, for example. The wages are higher, the conditions are better. And the apparel manufacturers, this we heard when we were visiting Ho Chi Minh, said, we're having to raise our wages, and importantly, we're having to cool our buildings in order to hold on to the workers we've got, because they can earn more and work in better conditions across the street at the smartphone factory. So that tight labor market is forcing the apparel industry to make these changes. So you want both. You want the labor market to say, or you want unions in negotiations, not really a thing in Vietnam. You want unions in negotiations and a tight labor market to improve working conditions and wages. And you want regulation to say to the manufacturers, here's the minimum standard. You can't go below this. And we've done that on lots of other issues, on hours, on worker safety and health generally. But this heat issue has been left off the list.
And one thing that really jumped out to me in your report was, the different types of, companies that were mentioned. So, like you said, the Nikes, the large companies, but also some of the mid-level and small companies. And I'm really wondering about this question of, budgeting and things like that. I'm wondering how many companies out there really budget for this idea of, hey, we really need to make sure that the people we're purchasing our products from, we can budget for, like you said, rising cost of, air conditioning, for example, or, preventing flooding in the factories or anything like that. How many companies would you say budget for these types of things?
Well, that's a good question. Maybe Anne wants to take a crack at that one. The relationship between the buyer and the supplier when they're talking about costs and price can be a real dance. Anne, do you want to try that one?
Yes, of course. Thanks, Jason. Thanks. Actually, it's very, very good questions. Yeah. I think the heat and the flood is not part of the equations yet. Doesn't mean that the brands are not looking at this, but this is a new things, like Jason has mentioned about the overtime, about some other safety nets. The brands has looked to it. If you look, in the past, with what happened in Bangladesh on building, for example, the minute it happens, actually the brands start to tighten up, the safety of the buildings of every factories that they produce from, right? Just because of this one incident in Bangladesh, not just because of that incidents, right? But with what Jason has mentioned on heat and flood, actually this report is just newly done last month, right, Jason? And it has been spread out, so it would give the thinking. But of course, the global warming is not only on the brands or fashions; it's actually the whole world problems. Right. And it's also not about the heat rising, but also about the flood with regards to global warming. But I do think that no one yet thinking about this, but there is a way to think about this. And the way is actually it all end up to the end users of the brands. They really, all the US buyers, end users, all the European end users, all the Asia end users, all the Australia end users, all the Africans, Middle East end users. If we want to really save the planet, please make sure that we all buy things responsibly, right? Where you actually look where the goods are being procured and how safe the brands actually look at this, right? Then this would, of course, make the brands also empowered, and therefore they actually be carefully look at this. And of course, when it comes to global supply chain clean one, the brands are not going to play around with squeezing price anymore. The freedom of speech are there. Our workers can actually do a social media. If the brands try to squeeze, everything is very transparent here in Indonesia. I'm sure that the rest of the world start to get more transparency. And the key is actually transparency, right? If it's transparent from end to end, if it's traceable from end to end, the end users of this fashion can choose which brands that they would like to procure from. And the brands would cater the needs of the end users. At the end of the day, the one that can save the world is the world itself, right? If there's no demand on the squeezy brand, or if there's no demand on the dirty brands, at the end of the day, they cannot win against the viciousness of the market, right? The market needs to save the world. At the end of, I mean, that's logical. If there is no demand, there is no supply.
And the point we make in the paper towards the end, where we discuss governance, is that the market won't by itself, by magic, won't make the right choice. That it needs to be, it's constantly shaped and reshaped by political forces. And we don't talk about this much in the report, but it's an important issue. What's the role of the consumer here? And it's a fraught question. Consumers are often, particularly the younger generation, is asked. I'm 50, so I mean by that I mean 20-somethings, 30-somethings. They're asked, would you pay more for a garment or a phone or a pair of shoes made in these conditions? And they naturally say, yes, of course I would. But when you compare those polling results with the receipts at the retail level, you can see that there's a huge gap between the way we think about who we are and how we consume and the way we behave when we're in front of the rack and it's the right size and it's the right color and it's the right price and I gotta have it now, and you're not looking at the label, you don't know where that is, and you don't know anything about the factory, and you don't care because I gotta have it now. And it's hard in that moment to make smart choices. I should buy something that'll last longer. I should buy something that's made with organic cotton. I should buy from a label that pays all the workers living wages in the factories that they contract with. That's a more complex calculus. And as consumers, we're not trained that way. It's like the difference between when you're buying a car. Oh, I should buy an electric vehicle. But it costs twice as much, or it doesn't have the interior I want. So we make poor choices. I despair of the consumers, the individualist ability to save us. So we need of course consumer pressure, but we also need regulation that says, okay, we're not playing around. This is an urgent problem. Here's the standard. We're going to have to meet it. We're going to have to meet it, and in a hurry. Otherwise, we're gonna warm impossibly. We're gonna be at 4 degrees Celsius by the end of this century, and life as we know it will have changed radically. We don't want that. Here are some rules that'll help us get there.
I do have to say, Jason, I definitely am one of those who have to buy it now. I can't order online. I have to have it in my hand. I'm mid-30s, so I'm sorry, audience, but I'm old school. I have to feel it and make sure it's the right size and everything. But speaking actually of the consumer, we just got a great audience question in, and maybe Jason, you can answer this first, and then Ann, you can answer it second. But Colleen said, Ann, your building's lovely and everything, and she loves your building. But her question was, do you have any tips for consumers who want to support clean supply chains? And maybe Jason, you can answer this first, and then Ann, we'll hear from you.
Yeah, it's a tough one because there's a whole raft of certifications out there, and as a
Mm-hmm.
consumer, it's hard to know what each one represents and how rigorous its standard is. Some of these standards are indeed high,
Mm-hmm.
and some of them are pretty bare bones. So, but each one gets a stamp, and if you don't know what you're looking for and what each one represents, then it's hard to know. I guess probably the best guide is the brand itself. So, is the
Mm-hmm.
company that buys is the company that contracts with a factory like with a manufacturer like Pan Brothers, like Ann's
Mm-hmm.
firm, does it pay attention to all the issues that I care about? So you have to spend time in advance,
Mm-hmm.
thinking, researching who are these folks? How do they think about the planet? How do they think about workers? What sort of investments have they made? Do their factories pay a living wage? Are they buying from countries where there's no such thing as freedom of association, and workers, if they try to organize a union, could be imprisoned? So
Mm-hmm.
those are sort of those are red flags, and you want to pick a brand or a retailer that's thought hard about these issues and has built a sourcing strategy that sort of answers all your big questions.
Mm-hmm.
And there are some out there. There's just you can count them on a couple of hands.
And similar, and to Colleen's point, again, she said your building's lovely. What tips can we as consumers do when we want to think about supporting some clean supply chains? What can we do as consumers, Ann?
Okay, so this every brands right now, responsible brands, have
Mm-hmm.
sustainability report. And within that sustainability report, they actually have accredited other independents on it, which require either better buying a survey result, or also their journey towards, for example, net zero or scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. Right now, the journey towards net zero, and also about their CSR. Their CSR means their corporate social responsibility with regards to purchasing the goods from, right? That actually a big hint for everyone. So I'm not talking about specific brands here, but brands that actually go to extra miles to ensure that it's there. They actually want to be very transparent with all the audience or the end users. And of course, from our end, which has labor union and not, we also look at their sustainability report, whether what they stated is true. Because otherwise we will report to, other means we have ILO, we have other things if they report differently, right? That's number one. Second, like Jason has mentioned earlier, I think what we all need to know is that there are certain countries that goes extra miles to ensure that freedom of association is being addressed. Because with freedom of associations, you see different spectrum, right? Because even our workers can put anything in the social media when you have freedom of associations. When there is no freedom of association, it's a bit differently, because things can be capped, everything put in the dark, and you don't know anything. It's where the country is being enforced. And I do agree with Jason there that sometimes a country need to be packed in terms of regulations, because it's also quite hard if it's not there and everything is in the dark, right? I'm not saying this to provocate countries that doesn't have freedom of speech or association yet, but this is for human nature, right? That, if you are being packed, if everything in the black, how can it be clean? No matter what's being said in the sustainability report, right? And third, last but not least, I think, I always joke with my brands, yeah. Brands, the minute we put your brands or your logo in our website, that means you are part of a clean brand. Why? Because we in the top management, we guard the whole Pan Brothers with a fierce arm, and I'm like a mother hen, where if my children is being harmed, I will say, okay, no, I don't want you. I don't want you to be part. I don't want you as a brand to be part of our supply chain because I don't see result. I don't see longevity with you. Why I have to go extra miles with you when I know it's being short terms? The game of manufacturing clothing is not short term because the amount of working force, the amount of people work for us is lifetime. If that is their lifetime. So why I have to be associated with a short-term brand? So we cannot be desperate like that. We have to think through which brand we want to be associated with. And that's actually, as a leader, it's very hard to say no, yeah. No to the brand, no to our workers, being very decisive. But we have to do what it must be done. Because we are responsible for a large labor-intensive human being. And you can talk to my friends, yeah, they always say, oh my God, Anna, a tiger hen. And so I said, I don't care. I care about, I meet my maker. When I meet my maker, I can say to my maker, God, I have done everything possible that you gave me. And this is it, right? I think every one of us are responsible for that, right? Being a human being, you need to care about being a human. And action is start from us buying clothes, buying small things for ourselves. Don't look at your neighbor. Don't look at your brother, sister. You look at yourself and don't be tempted on a cheap stuff when you know it's not clean, right? Perfect. You might look good, but behind you are looking good. You're actually playing for the world, right? I mean, it's a sin, it's a sin. To me, I only have one God, so I'm really
Nick,
anything,
If we've got 30 seconds, I had two quick thoughts. One is, Anne's talking about freedom of association, the right of workers to organize a union and bargain. And having done this sort of work for 20 years, 30 years, I know what a struggle that can be. Even in countries where it's permitted by law, the employers, the government effectively suppress it. It's not the case everywhere, but it's the case in lots of places where apparel and footwear are made. So it is on paper an elegant solution, but it's not honored. It's not defended. So it doesn't solve this problem on a large scale. There is an alternative, which is sort of industry level bargaining. So union federations bargaining with employer federations, and buyers are in the picture. So all the players are at the table and figuring out together, this is what our business model needs to look like. This is what our relationships should be, so that we can do all the things that we say we care about, protecting our profits, reducing risk for workers, ensuring living wages. That doesn't happen factory by factory. It's too much of a grind. So it's these national or global level agreements that are the coming thing. And the other, we're almost out of time. The last thought I had was back to the question about consumers. What do we do as consumers? I had a few thoughts there, but the big one is, what do we do as citizens? Because when we talk about writing a set of rules that will deal with an urgent problem, and climate breakdown qualifies as an urgent problem, what do we do as citizens to help, as I said, raise the floor for the whole industry? And there's interest in Washington, and there's interest in Brussels, the European Union headquarters, in connecting legal liability for the lead firm. So if you're Nike or you're H&M and your business practices are leading to harms for workers or the environment along your supply chain, then you're liable for a share of those harms. You haven't conducted sufficient, what they call, due diligence. You haven't done enough to ensure that workers will be safe, for example, in your contract factories. And it's not enough to say, well, the manufacturer wasn't paying attention to the problem. If the lead firm is paying a price that makes careful, diligent pro-worker production impossible, then it's the lead firm that should share in the cost. They're creating the harm, and they have to share in the cost of of remedying it. So as citizens, those are the sorts of things that we should be asking for. That will change the business model that we're all fed up with after 30 years.
Well, Jason, Ann, thank you so much. And just very, very quickly before we wrap, if you both could reach out to the audience and give them one piece of advice or one thing to think about, as they kind of get back to work or when they're thinking about buying their next piece of clothing or footwear, what's that one thing you would want them to know? Jason, we'll start off with you, and then Ann will go to you.
Oh gosh. Well, I guess it's what I finished with. We think about ourselves as consumers. We also have to think about ourselves as citizens and imagine the sort of rules we want so that we can get large scale change.
Perfect. And Ann, similar.
Be action driven, just one day at a time. Be responsible because we are human.
That's perfect. That is perfect to where we can leave us. Well, guys, thank you so much for joining me again. Audience, thank you so much for your questions. Thank you so much for watching us. Just one very quick last thing. We have a QR code if you want to scan that. Just let us know kind of how we did. Give us a little bit of feedback and tell us what we can improve on, all that good stuff. And Jason, thank you again so much for joining me. And audience, we'll see you at the next keynote.